All right, you ready for session 2, everybody? All right, take it away, Duff.
All right, thank you very much. It's interesting how you can look at something and not really see it. You look and you look, but you don't really see it. I mean, I noticed that sometimes I came across an article not too long ago where they talked about how people who actually design brands do this, so that when you look at the FedEx truck as it goes by, it's easy to miss the arrow that's in the side over there on the second word X. Or some of you probably know this, that in the word Wendy's, how many know the kind of hidden, that actually Wendy's necklace spells out mom, because that was Dave, the guy that founded Wendy's himself was an orphan. Or for example, in F1 you see the 1. How many about this one? This is interesting. How many know there's an extra kiss hidden in the Hershey's Kisses logo? Anybody know where it is? Yeah. You actually have to turn your head again this direction, but this time I'll turn it for you. But if you actually zoom in on the I and the K, you see another kiss there. Yeah. Or some of them are kind of simple. Like here, you probably see, when Baskin Robbins first started, it started out with 31 flavors, and so you can see the 31. The Milwaukee Brewers, they have kind of a cool logo, because with the Milwaukee Brewers, they have an M and a B all encased in a baseball glove, which is kind of cool, and the ball right in the middle. Goodwill, this is interesting. Goodwill actually has a G, obviously, in their logo, but also hidden in there is the elephant trunk. So you get stuff out of your trunk and take it over to Goodwill. Or how about this one? I bet you've seen this one before. How many know what the secret is on this one? Yeah, that there's actually a bunny and a duck. This one actually, you have two people and they're actually dipping Tostito into the sauce there. This is kind of cool in the Brooklyn Zoo. Hidden in the legs of the giraffes is the skyline of New York City. And then this is kind of a cool one from Pittsburgh Zoo. A little bit derivative, but if you look at that one, you can see it. There it is. And similarly, this one from Hope for Africa Children Initiative, I think this was really kind of beautiful, actually. You see an image of a guy and a woman. And this one, maybe you've seen it, maybe you know it, maybe you don't. It's a little bit more obscure. But did you know how they got the Toyota symbol, the Toyota emblem? That actually in that emblem is the spelling of Toyota. The spelling of Toyota. So actually in their symbol, in that brand, the word Toyota is actually spelled out. How many actually knew that? Yeah, I actually made that up at breakfast. This one's kind of cool. This one, Chick-fil-A. If you zoom in really, really close on this one, it's interesting. It says, "Eat more Bible." But no, I mention this because I think it's easy. When you look at stuff like this, you look at it, but it's very, very easy to not actually see all that there is to see. It reminds me of a statement made by Henry David Thoreau. He says, the question is not what you look at. The question is not what you look at, but what you see. And I mention this because I think in making wise decisions, looking carefully at the culture and listening thoughtfully to the word are two essential elements of a Christian mind. Because first of all, culture is full of beauty and wonder and goodness and joy and truth. God made the world. It's not as if everything in the world is bad. All of the world has been tainted by sin, but that doesn't mean that everything in the world is bad or everything in the world is ugly. I don't know if you noticed it, but when you came in, we were listening to a playlist that Dave Shalloway had actually curated for this event. And I remember the very first song was, Celebrate. The next song, I think, was Kansas. And quite a few, frankly, just pagan satanic songs. But hey, it's a great song. It's just because it doesn't necessarily mention Jesus. I mean, it was God who created an A note to be 440 vibrations per second. God is the author of music. So we don't have to hate everything of culture. That's not wisdom. That's actually ignorance. That's actually not seeing what there is to see. Having said that, and this is, I think, a point that we made clearly, I hope, in the first session, culture is also a river that sweeps us up in its currents. It can erode moral thought. It can drown out biblical discernment, and it can overflow God-given boundaries that mark the difference between a good gift and a destructive catastrophe. That is the whole point of the Issachar initiative, is to help us to understand, to help us to discern the difference. Jesus sort of chided the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He says, they tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He says, look, when evening comes, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. We need, as people who want to practice wisdom, people who know how to listen carefully and look carefully. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I think, put it best. He said, the first service that one owes to others consists in listening to them. Many people are looking for an ear that will listen. They do not find it quite often among Christians, because these Christians are talking when they should be listening. Christians have forgotten that the ministry of listening has been committed to them by him who is himself the great listener, and whose work they would share. We should listen with the ears of God, that we may speak the word of God. This is true wisdom. Now, we've given ourselves a task this morning of thinking about how do we make straight choices in a crooked world. We said in the very first session that, yes, there are some very real challenges, that we have a bad compass, we have bad company and bad comprehension, but that one of the ways to begin thinking about making wise decisions, straight choices in a crooked world, is to first of all stop and think backwards. And then, just when this session ended, if you remember, this room was electric with anticipation. I said, what we need to do now is think about, okay, how do we secondly look for the lie? How do we look for the lie? And so that's actually what I want us to talk about in this session. How do we look for the lie? I remember several years ago, I was speaking at this event up in upstate New York. And I think I was preaching at a church up there on a Sunday morning. And so I was just, in that area in Albany. And I read this headline in the morning newspaper that said, kissing booth volunteer found to have hepatitis. And I love stories like this. And so I go, wow, kissing booth volunteer found to have hepatitis. And what it was they were going to have a fundraiser for the March of Dimes there in Albany County, New York. But they had to figure out, how do we get money to give support to the March of Dimes? And most of you know the March of Dimes is this wonderful charity that provides money for children who are born with birth defects. It's a wonderful charity, and they wanted to raise money, but how do we do that? And someone said, well, why don't we have like a carnival? Oh, that's a great idea. What else? How are we going to get people to come to why don't we have a theme? Okay, what's our theme going to be? And I said, I know, let's make our theme. Remember that old TV show, MASH? We're going to use the old TV show MASH. I think actually the theme song from that show is on Dave Shalloway's mixtape. But anyway, so let's do MASH. And so great. So they called it the MASH Bash. And the idea was that you'd come to the carnival and there'd be different booths. And so like you had one vendor who was, the Corporal Klinger's used dress closet, and they had different booths. And one of the booths there was the Hot Lips Houlihan kissing booth. The Hot Lips Houlihan kissing booth. And it was fantastic because basically they had this beautiful woman there, and you get to kiss her for $1. $1. Like, who can resist pucker for a bucker? And so it seemed like a great idea. Well, anyway, they had the big event, and the big night came, and it was actually quite successful. Raised a lot of money for the March of Dimes. Everybody was thrilled, except in the wee hours of the morning following the MASH Bash, local hospitals in Albany County, New York, began to see patients arriving in with severe complaints of nausea and vomiting. And of course, you've been to an emergency room, one of the first things that happens when you check in is they want to check on your recent history. Because they want to find out, have you eaten, tainted meat? Or have you maybe been in a pool that was not properly sanitized or something like that? When they began to pool the information from other patients in the emergency room and then collate it with reports and complaints from other hospitals in the area, they noticed 100% of the patients had been to the MASH bash. And so, of course, they figured, okay, it's probably a food vendor there at the MASH bash. And because, intriguingly, 100% of the complainants were male, they figured it was probably a food vendor, somebody selling just beef, and so, and by the way, we have a men's dinner here tonight, sorry, no kissing booth, but anyway, if you're interested in coming to that, talk to Dave Shalloway, but anyway, so they go, aha, but then they found out some of the patients hadn't been to a food vendor, but the one place they had all been was the Hot Lips Houlihan kissing booth. And so it took them 2 days to track down the woman who had been staffing the booth. And anyway, when they found her, they tested her. Unbeknownst to her, she had a very infectious strain of hepatitis. And so they had to publish a public notice in the Albany, New York newspaper, which is what I actually read, that said, if you kiss this woman at the MASH bash, you are at risk of contracting a very serious disease. You need to get a shot. You need to see your personal physician within 48 hours. And if you can't get with your personal physician, you can come to the Albany County Health Commissioner's office, or whatever it was, the local county health office, and you can get a shot, and the shot will cost $5. And I just remember myself thinking, as I'm reading the article, what a bummer, right? I mean, what a bummer, because you first of all, and maybe it's just because I'm a guy, but I just think, here's this guy walks in, he sees the MASH bash, he sees this beautiful woman there, you get to kiss her for $1, and he thinks to himself, it's a good cause. And it's the least I can do for my fellow man. And so, and there's a lot of need out there. Maybe I'll kiss her 3 times. And so anyway, he feels pretty good about it. Then he finds out that unbeknownst to him, he has a very serious disease. Oh, wait a minute. And there's another problem. They told him this kiss was going to cost him $1. No, it's going to cost him $5, $5 more. And I mentioned this episode this morning because this is a parable of the way sin works in our life. We look at something that looks very, very seductive, very, very attractive, and before you know it, we realize this is going to cost us a lot more than we thought. This is the nature of sin. That's why it's so critical that we learn to look carefully. The writer of Proverbs says, the lips of the adulterous woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end, she is as bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. To make wise choices, you have to stop and think backwards. But then you need to learn to look for the lie. You need to learn to look carefully, listen carefully, not just for the lie, but also for the truth. And so in this session, and I mean, we're going to blow through this stuff. It's on page 2. We want to think about some strategies for learning how to look carefully. Look carefully. I think probably one guy that is really best known, a guy who's a really dear friend, but also a wonderful thinker in terms of culture, is a guy by the name of Walt Mueller. Some of you know Walt. He actually lives just out in Elizabethtown, but he runs what's called the Center for Parent and Youth Understanding. And Walt made a statement that I think is just so brilliant. Walt said that oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Walt said culture must be viewed from 2 sides. Culture must be viewed from 2 sides. On one hand, it is directive. On one hand, it's directive. In other words, we listen carefully, we look carefully at culture because it is directive. It is directive. If I put this image on the screen, I will typically hear that sound. I will typically hear somebody go, "Aw." Just like that. Aw. Those exact 3 notes. Aw. Nobody ever goes, aw. It's never 3 different notes. It's exactly those notes. And you know what's amazing? That's true if I'm speaking in South Africa or if I'm speaking to teenagers in Ireland or in Australia. They do the same thing. I put a picture like that and go, aw. Because we have been directed by the culture. This is not a biological response. This is not the way people for centuries have responded. This is not even the way people in every single culture. Some people see that and go, yummy. You know, I mean, the fact of the matter is that this is a learned, a directed response. One thing we know about culture, it is directive. It is directive. I could go through, had you the time this morning, I could go through and I could show you a number. There are any number of research projects that have demonstrated how culture is directive, that it impacts the way we behave. It tells us, it directs us what to do. And you can see it in the lives of influencers who are paid thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars because they influence, because they direct. And you really can't see the fine print on the chart, but you can see that the music and the gaming and the celebrity and the humor, those are the major influences in the lives of U.S. teens. Well, I'll just give you one example. I'm going to zoom in on one just example of this. Picture me drinking. This is an academic study. Alcohol-related posts by Instagram influencers popular among adolescents for young adults. So the research here is to find out what kind of influence do Instagram influencers have on the drinking habits of young adults. In a content analysis of Instagram posts of 178 popular influencers we investigated, one, how many and how often influencers post about alcohol. Number two, what type of influencers post about alcohol. Number three, what are the characteristics of influencers' alcohol posts. And number four, to what extent these alcohol posts are commercialized. In other words, do they show the brand and the sponsorship that they're being given to be an influencer? And again, we don't have time to go into this in big detail, but let me just quickly survey this. Results showed four main findings. The majority of influencers posted about alcohol recently. Number two, alcohol posts were positive. They showed a social context. In other words, it happened with a group of people, and were mostly posted by lifestyle influencers. Number three, although a fair amount of alcohol posts showed a clear alcohol brand, almost a fifth, only a few of those posts disclosed this as an advertisement, and even fewer gave an educational slogan like no 18, no alcohol. And number four, in fact, the posts that did show sponsorship disclosures yielded fewer likes and comments than posts without such disclosures. In other words, the young people liked it better when they didn't know they were being duped by a paid advertiser. A post hoc additional study that focused solely on minors confirmed these conclusions. These findings suggest that there is a lot to be concerned about in this context, especially since many minors can be exposed to influencers' alcohol posts, potentially leading to increased drinking among this vulnerable age group. So when we talk about the directive nature of culture, that's what we're talking about. That's why we pay attention to culture. That's one of the reasons why we want to look for the truth, look for the lie, because this is telling us how to live our lives. But culture is not just directive, it is also reflective. It is also reflective. One of the really good books that I could recommend in this regard is a book by Daniel Strange called Plugged In. But I wanted this morning just read to you one little quote from Daniel Strange's book because he captures well the point that I want to make here. He says, so your favorite soap opera has a plot with characters who fall out, make up, and get together. But that story expresses meaning about the world. The plot communicates something about what the people making it think is heroic, what is despicable, what is truly valuable, as do Trainspotting and Titanic, Sweet Child of Mine and Single Ladies, Pride and Prejudice, and Real Housewives of Orange County, Facebook and Fortnite, Tracy Emin's My Bed and Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, BuzzFeed and BBC News. All of these, in one way or another, are telling stories that express meaning about the world around us. In other words, they reflect our values. They tell us something about ourselves. So this morning, what we want to do in this brief time is to think about, well, how do we exegete? How do we look carefully? How do we draw in, zoom in on these stories so that we can understand something about the way they direct us to live and how they reflect what we think is important. And what I want to do this morning, just for the sake of time, is I want to try to break it down to, there are many ways we could do this kind of cultural exegesis. But I think one of the simplest, one of the easiest to use is the one developed by Walt Mueller. He calls it a 3D approach, a 3D approach. And I've given you some contact information in the back of the outline for how to find out more about CPYU, Walt's ministry, and even to get more information about this 3D approach. But let me just begin by saying Walt basically suggests that or argues, I would say, that we have to base our view when we look and when we listen. We have to base our view on three important values. If we're going to be biblical in our worldview, we first of all have to recognize that Scripture is God's Word. That's the lens through which we look. Number two, that we look with a biblical worldview, that we look through the lens that understands God created the world fell, Jesus redeemed the world through the cross, and that one day this redeeming process will culminate with the whole world in a new kingdom and a new earth. And this is the view of the world that we have to look through. We have to understand that bigger picture, or we're going to mistake every tiny little picture that we see. A beautiful way of capturing these four kind of big chapters in the grand story is an art piece done by a guy named David Arns. And I think I put the information in your outline, ARNS. You could actually find this image online. But you can see how it starts off with the creation, and then the fall, the bleak and the darkness and the death of the fall in Genesis chapter 3. And then, of course, the recreation, the redemption beginning, the new life beginning to spring forth with Easter and resurrection, and then one day a new heaven and a new earth. And based on all of that, we need to practice discernment. We need to exercise discernment. How do we look for the lie? How do we look for the beauty? How do we listen and look carefully? And you can, if you're doing work with youth workers or you're a Christian school teacher, you can actually get a very, very helpful little booklet. You can order these through cpyu.org that will walk your students or your grandchild or whatever. You can walk them through this process that utilizes what we're going to discuss today as a 3D approach. So let's jump into this thing and let's talk about it. 3D approach. The 3D approach basically has three main components, and the first component is to discover. The second component is to discern. To discern, in other words, what are we actually looking at? This is where the looking for the lie, looking for the truth, looking for the beauty. This is where it comes in, and then ultimately the last decision is deciding, what am I going to do? How do I make a wise decision? Will I participate? Will I consume? Will I purchase? Will I promote this or use this artifact, this cultural artifact? So let's look at each of these three in a little bit more depth one at a time. Beginning with discover. Discover. If you look right there near the top of the page, on page 2, you'll notice that I'm talking about discover. Asking questions of the piece. Asking questions of this piece. In other words, let's say there's some cultural artifact. Maybe it's a television show. Maybe it's a newspaper ad. Maybe it's a magazine ad. Maybe it's something posted online. Maybe it's a TikTok video. The very first step in making wise choices is to look carefully by trying to discover what it is we see. This is pretty much the methodology that Paul seemed to demonstrate in Acts chapter 17 at the Areopagus. He said, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. He found this, Luke tells us, by walking around and looking carefully at the objects of worship. Those are Luke's words. I walked around carefully. I looked at your objects of worship. And so, in other words, what we're talking about here is simply taking time to really look thoughtfully. Really look thoughtfully. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. This is an ad from DKNY. We're not going to be able to take time this morning to look at it really carefully or thoughtfully. I'm going to have to do most of the looking on your behalf because I've seen the images before. But right off the bat, when you look at this image, first of all, you realize with the words be delicious, it is saying something about the role of a woman. The role of a woman is to be consumed. She is to be consumed. She's a consumptive product, and her big job is to be delicious to the guys. That's her big role. That's why she's there. And you can sort of notice as you look at this, especially on the left-hand side, that there's kind of this nod to Genesis chapter 3, isn't there? There's kind of this interesting little intrigue, innuendo that points us to the original story of Eve in the Garden of Eden and how she tempts Adam. How she says, taste this fruit, it's really something. And then also it's interesting too when you look at this, and I'm kind of coming to you with the benefit. My students at Grove City College, I do give them time to look at these images and listen to their observations. So I'm maybe jumping a little bit ahead here, but they look at this. Some of them will talk about the fact that the gas tank of the motorcycle is almost phallic. I mean, the way it's shaped, the way it's postured, the girl's legs are spread open. Somebody commented to me that dress would not be very effective on a motorcycle ride. That would really, at about 5 miles an hour, become more of a windshield than anything else. It's not going to be very helpful in terms of covering up. So in other words, all we're doing is we're just taking some to look carefully at a cultural artifact and looking at that closely. And so if I were sort of, let's say, talking to a room full of students, I might say to my students, what do you see here? One of the questions that I ask my students, for example, in looking carefully and just taking time to discover is, I asked them, I said, you see the couple on the right, this is in the second of the two ads, do you think this couple is married? And guess what they say? They say, not a chance. Not a chance. No married couple looks this happy. I mean, that's just absolutely slam dunk. 100% of them say, no way. I said, actually, beg your pardon. It is possible, that if you marry wisely, you can know that kind of joy. But all I'm saying is, you start off in the discovery process by actually looking carefully at the picture. You don't just say, that's bad. That's sin, that's good, that's beautiful, or wow, I want to buy DKNY products. You discover. You take time to look carefully. Now, there are a lot of ways we could talk about this morning, but I thought in the time that we have, one of the most practical ways to approach it would be to use four different tools that are provided for us in Francis Schaeffer's book, Art and the Bible. Now, Schaeffer was a wonderful Christian thinker back in the 60s and the 70s. I believe he died in the 80s. He was a brilliant thinker, frankly, ahead of his time in a lot of ways. But this book, Art in the Bible, provides us what he calls 4 different standards of art. So let's say when I'm looking at some cultural artifact, could be a painting, could be a song, could be a television show, could be a movie, but it could also be, for that matter, a magazine ad. It could be almost anything. I could use these 4 standards as a criteria by which I discover, by which I evaluate and critique what I'm looking at. The first he describes as technical excellence. Technical excellence. And when he's talking here about technical excellence, what he's really talking about is the sound, the unity, the production quality. You don't have to write down those words in the blanks if you don't want to. The sound, the unity, the production quality. In other words, he's simply saying, how well is this product made? I could look at the DKNY ad and say, that's pretty clever. That's pretty well done. I could look at a commercial on TV and not really like the product at all. In fact, maybe even object to it. But I have to admit, that's pretty funny. Well, that's very well done. The production quality, the creativity, I can admire that. Because guess who is the author of that creativity? It's the Creator. It's a fingerprint of God. It's a fingerprint of God. I can see they could not have done that had it not been for the designer himself. I don't have to like what they did, but I can see that there's technical excellence there. Secondly is validity. And by validity, he's asking, is the artist true and honest to himself or herself? Is the artist true and honest to himself or herself and to their worldview? is the artist true and honest to himself and to their worldview? And then fourthly, third is content. I'm going to come back and talk about each of these in just a little bit more detail. Third is content, and then last is integration of content and vehicle. Let's go through the list one more time, a little bit more detail. First of all, technical excellence. We said this is the sound, the unity, the production quality and stuff. This is just, is this product really done well? Does it reflect some artistry? Does it reflect some genius? Does it reflect some creativity? Validity is a little bit more complicated. We said validity is the artist true and honest to himself or herself and to his or her own worldview. To give you an example of this, some of you remember back, I don't remember now, wasn't, probably 4 or 5 years ago, Kanye West put out an album that a lot of Christians heralded as sort of a breakthrough album because it had Christian themes. This is a little clip from one of the music videos used to promote that album. This is from Kanye, now known as Ye, and Sing to the Power of the Lord Come Down. Let's watch. A lot of people thought, man, this is fantastic. This is a real, powerful moment for the church, because here's a guy who's kind of a renowned figure in pop culture, and he has now come out to the Lord's great delight, endorsing Jesus, and this is going to be a great thing. Some of you may know, however, that more recently he introduced his most recent project. It's called Vultures. And I want you to listen to what he says in an interview about the Vultures Project.
Are you in that space where you're comfortable enough to say, this is where I am right now? I'm still a man of God. Jesus still is king. But this is Vultures right now. This is where I am.
It is, but I don't want to see with Jesus. There's a lot of stuff I went through, and I prayed and I didn't see Jesus show up. So I had to put my experience in this world, my experience, my children, my experience, other people, my experience, my account, my experience, my brand, and my experience with the level of music that I was dealing with in my own hands.
So the question would be then, in terms of validity, you go, okay, then clearly that project, you have to say, that might have made money, it might have gained him some acclaim, but it wasn't really, it's not really something you could say that is spoken with integrity. That there's a shift here, there's a slipperiness there. And that's really what Schaefer's talking about when he's talking about validity. Is this artist true to himself or herself and his worldview? In terms of content, now we're looking directly at the stuff that reflects the worldview of the artist. So in other words, is it a message, that, given a biblical worldview, is it a message that speaks truth? Maybe the artist does not intend it to, but inadvertently does speak truth. In other words, truth that is aligned with the biblical worldview. Or maybe even, it doesn't totally speak the truth, but it does have some themes in it that are very biblical themes. I'm going to show you a clip that is, I think, especially powerful. It's performed by a guy named Moby, who's not a believer. This is Moby and the Avoid Pacific Choir. And because this one is, I think, especially noteworthy, I'm going to play the whole clip. But I think it's a pretty good example of someone whose content deserves to be watched. So let's watch it. Now, Moby's not a believer. He's not a Christian at all. I think he sort of believes in sort of an Eastern religion. I've done some reading about his own personal spirituality. But one thing I would have to argue is that he does an amazing job of capturing the lostness of humanity. I mean, I can imagine Paul at the Areopagus, had he had this that song by Moby? Well, guess what? Luke 19:10, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Okay, so there's truth to be seen there if we will discover it, if we will look carefully at it. Yes, it wasn't spoken intentionally to sort of promote the gospel, but because the gospel speaks of the way life really is and where the world really is, a truthful artist with integrity can't help but observe these things that the scripture actually speaks to be true. So when we're talking about content, that's what we mean. And then lastly, integration of content and vehicle. On integration of content and vehicle. Really what we're asking here, does the medium cohere with the message? In other words, does the sound, does the style, does the look fit the content or the worldview that is being presented? So you remember, probably some of you remember that guy who used to show up at professional sporting events. I think you still see him occasionally, but he had this rainbow afro. And he would show up and he had a sign that said John 3:16. Anybody remember that guy? Yeah, and I mean, I don't know the guy and I don't know his heart. I mean, God bless him, but you got to believe that it's not likely that somebody's going to see a guy with a rainbow afro and go, I'm going to start reading my Bible. There's nothing there that necessarily in that particular medium, that particular gesture that adorns the message of John 3:16. That's kind of what he's talking about here. Give an example of what I'm talking about. We're going to just watch a short clip. We don't have time. I'm sorry to watch more. But this is the song Sweet Home Alabama, performed by the Red Army Men's Chorus. Let's watch. Now, if you listen carefully, you can actually hear members of the Leonard Skinner rolling over in their graves. But it's interesting because just to think about, here we go, Russian soldiers singing this song, Sweet Home. There might be 1,000 bands that could really credibly perform that particular piece of music, but this particular mode, this particular vehicle doesn't really seem to cohere with that particular song. That's really what Schaeffer's talking about when he talks about integration of content and vehicle. There's so much that can be said about this. Let me just suggest, I put in the outline some very brief, very sketchy bibliography. There are a number of books that approach this. If you go to the cpyu.org website, you can see a much more extensive bibliography, and you could start there. One of the links that I did put in the website is a link to this site. It's called How to Do a Visual Analysis. And if you want to get your phone out and take a picture of that site, this is the tiny URL version. I'm going to show you the extended version so you could take two pictures just in case the tiny URL link doesn't work for you. This is the exact same site, just two different links to get to it. This is from the Visual Communication Guide. But this is a really, really helpful infographic about how to look at any piece, not just from a biblical worldview, but how to study, how to look carefully and think carefully so that you can discover what it is you see, okay? That's discover. The next D in the 3D approach is discern, Paul, having given some thought to what he's seen and looked at around the Areopagus in that area, he then says, now, to these listeners, he says, here's what I'm seeing. Here's the lie that I'm hearing. Here's the incorrect ideas that I'm coming across. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think the divine being is like gold or silver or stone. In other words, he is now identifying, wait a minute, I've taken time to listen to your message, but let's think about it. Let's weigh it in the light of biblical truth. Let's weigh it in the light of a biblical worldview. What are we really seeing here? So what I'm talking about here is something as simple as this. I've done this with a group of students. I would say one of the most effective advertising campaigns of the last 20 years has been the Absolute Vodka campaign that utilized basically different images in the shape and the profile of a vodka bottle. And you've all seen these, right? You see them in Sports Illustrated, GQ. I mean, almost every magazine, Time Magazine, Newsweek, Absolute Purity, Absolute Paradise, Absolute Iron Man. I did this very warm, fuzzy one at Christmas time, Absolute Joy. And so what I did with a group of teenagers, I said, okay, all right, now look, I'm not suggesting there's never any warmth or any joy that comes along in a bottle of vodka. What I'm suggesting is this. That's not the whole picture, and we are easily duped. There's more to the picture than you see. And so I want to juxtapose that picture with some truth in the effort of trying to promote some discernment. So what are the truth? Well, 80% of college-age people drink. Half of them binge drink on a regular basis. Alcohol is a driving factor in assault and sexual assault cases reported by people ages 18 to 24, which doesn't sound like a whole heck of a lot of joy. Number 3, 1 of every 10 children in America grows up with a parent who has a drinking problem. Every year in the U.S., about 5,000 young people under age 21 as a result of underage drinking. They die. And then lastly, 1 of every 6 Americans has a drinking problem. This is not sounding much like a lot of joy. That maybe if we weren't so easily duped, they would have to do an ad like this. Or maybe an ad like this. In other words, what you're doing is saying, I know what the message is. We've taken time to listen carefully to the message. We've discovered the message. Now let's exercise discernment. Let's look for the lie. Let's look for the beauty. Let's look for the good. This is one that's especially interesting. Some of you may have seen this one. This is from Dutch KLM Airlines. This is an ad they ran back during Pride Week a few years ago. It's kind of intriguing. It says, doesn't matter who you click with, Happy Pride Amsterdam. Royal Dutch Airlines. Now, what's interesting about this ad is that if you have even an ounce of discernment, you realize it contradicts itself. It contradicts itself. Because if you look at the first set of belts up there, they don't click. The second pair of belts, they don't click. There's only 1 of the 3 in the sets that clicks. And in fact, what's so interesting about this, you could go to any jet in the world operated by Dutch KLM airplanes, and guess what? They're only going to use the bottom belt. You know why? Because they're the only ones that click. But you see, that just, it's an interesting image. It's an intriguing image. You might even say it's creative. You can say, oh, okay, see what they're doing. But exercising discernment there, you can say, wait a minute, that does not ring true to reality. That doesn't ring true to reality. Another good tool for exercising discernment is sort of some terminology that Francis Schaeffer offers when he talks about content. If you look at the bottom of page 2, basically Schaeffer suggests 4 standards for evaluating art. In other words, he said you could have, at the end of the day, when you look at this thing and exercise discernment, you could say, okay, it's bad art, but it has a true message. It's bad art, but it has a true message. Some would argue that this is what happens with a lot of Christian music or a lot of Christian movies. It's bad art, I'll grant that, but it does have a true message. I'll have a true message. But we might say, well, then that's probably not going to be very convincing as an artistic communication bridge. Bad art with a true message, or it could be good art with a true message. It could be bad art with a false message. It could be bad art with a false message. And here, Schaeffer is reminding us that in terms of bad art with a false message, it could be something that, that maybe it's probably not even going to be paid much attention to because it's bad art to begin with, and people are probably not going to pay much attention to it. Or it could, at the end, be something that's actually, I think this is the right one. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to give an example here. Good art with a true message. I wanted to do that. Good art with a true message. Not necessarily Christian art, but it has a true message. So, for example, these artists, Tim Noble and Sue Webster, it's a British couple, and they're now divorced. But what's interesting about their art is they are found artists. So they'll take items that they found, in this case in a dumpster, and then they stack it together in such a way that when you shine light on it, all of a sudden you see an image that you never expected to see. And one of the reasons that I like the work of Noble and Webster, again, they're not believers. They're not trying to communicate this. But unbeknownst to themselves, what they're communicating is precisely the message of redemption. We give God our junk. He shines on it the light of his love. And all of a sudden, we see something that we never expected to see. People had given up on us. People said, oh, that's just trash. People said, you'll never amount to anything. But in the light of God's love, all of a sudden, something new emerges. So this would be an example of good art that's not necessarily Christian art, but it does portray a true message. So this artist, for example, is talking about the rage of sexual abuse. And uses an interesting technique in her photography. This is the same artist, again, talking about how some people are just tied to their jobs. This is an artist, a different one, who uses photography to remind us of the humanity in the everyday. Just take that bottom right picture. The way that picture is made is the artist actually stands at an angle to the window looking out on a cityscape. And then he has a person standing over here so that you can see her reflection in the window. But he takes the picture in such a way that you catch her reflection, and then through it, you see the city. And he said he did that to remind us that all of those buildings out there, they hold human beings. They hold people. And so he's trying to help people to see the humanity in the concrete of the everyday, in the concrete of the everyday. Okay, let me go down to, bad art with a false message, and then good art with a false message. This is probably the most insidious, because good art with a false message is a message that's very, very seductive. It's very attractive. You listen to it, you start to hum along, or you go to the movie, or you get hooked on the TV show, or you're drawn to the ad, or the TikTok video. And yet, over and over and over again, as Loftus and Palmer reminds us, we are being directed by what we see. We're being directed by what we see. And I really don't have time to show you some good examples of this, but frankly, the world is kind of full of this. The culture is full of this. What I will say is this, that we do need to pay attention, because I think Ted Turnow puts it well. When one does find depth in popular culture, it is important to take note, whether it's Christian culture or not. For there the deep desires of the many coalesce. When one sees idolatry in popular culture, one catches a view of society's widespread affliction and affection of the tempting and terrible effects of the fall played out culture-wide. When one sees grace, one catches a glimpse, if only for a brief moment, of that culture healed and cleansed, of God speaking his truth to the people, of popular culture the way it was meant to be. That's why I believe it's important to listen to popular culture. In popular culture, we see popular desire laid bare, and it needs a Christian response. So, discover and discern. The last component of the 3D approach that I want to mention before our break is decide. Decide. And again, this is where we come back to our original kind of thinking about wise choices. You have to stop and think backwards. You look for the lie. And ultimately, to make a wise decision from a biblical standpoint, you have to finally listen to the word. Listen to the word of God. So that's the third step in making wise choices. At the very bottom of page 2, listen to the word of God. Philippians 4:8 gives us a good example of what this is like. It's about basically making sure that what we see is here is true and beautiful and right and just. Psalm 19 puts it like this: the law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy. Notice these words: making wise the simple. And it's interesting. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't. But the word law here, probably most of us know, that the Hebrew word for law here is the word Torah. The word Torah. How many know that? The word Torah for law. It's the Hebrew word. What you may not know about this word Torah, it's a little bit striking, is that noun, Torah for law, comes from a verb that is the same root form in the Hebrew that means throw the rock. It means throw the rock. I mean, it even sounds like throw the rock. Torah, like throw the rock. You know, it sounds like throw the rock. And you go, well, wait a minute. Why in the Hebrew language would you have a noun, law, come from a verb that means throw the rock? And it's interesting. It's intriguing. Back in ancient Near Eastern culture, when it was a dark place and they didn't really know where to step and they didn't really know where to stop and there weren't any lights and you're walking along at night, you basically have a problem. You know you are in peril. And so what you do when you're walking along is you learn a little trick. You pick up a handful of rocks. And then as you're walking along, you throw the rocks out in front of you and you listen for the sound of their impact. And so if you hear the sound of a rock against wood, you go, oh, okay, I'm approaching a cart. And so you walk it, or if you hear the sound of a splash, you go, okay, I'm approaching a pool, right, or a body of water, which is a good thing to know in advance. Or maybe you hear the sound of a human voice. That means you're approaching an angry pedestrian. And basically the idea is that you throw the rock and you listen for the sound of its impact. And so the psalmist is reminding us that it's not enough just to discover. It's not enough just to discern, that if I want to decide, I need to decide by the light of God's word. That's precisely why the psalmist, this is exactly what the psalmist is thinking of when he writes in Psalm 119, your word is a lamp for my feet and a light on my path. Why do we need God's revealed world? Because we are easily duped. We are easily duped. To make straight choices in a crooked world, we have to stop and think backwards. We have to look for the lie. We have to listen to the word of God. There's some more resources in the outline that I'm not going to be able to cover this morning, but I think you'll find them helpful if you take a look. And then we'll jump back in after our break and think about some of the big ideas that sort of shape this whole picture that we are looking at. Dave, quick announcement. Thanks for listening.
Yes. So I apologize. I had to step out during this session, but I forgot to announce that I will be setting up a kissing booth up here. And I'll be having my playlist playing while it's going on. Does anybody know where my wife is, by the way? Okay, very good. Okay, we can take our break. I know where my wife is. We'll be back in 10 minutes, and take your break.